On the morning of April 21st, 2025, the world awoke to a moment that instantly etched itself into the pages of history. Pope Francis, the 266th leader of the Roman Catholic Church, had died at the age of 88. The Vatican released an official statement confirming his passing, citing complications from double pneumonia as the cause. And just like that, in the quiet breaking of dawn, an era came to an end. Almost immediately, the weight of the moment could be felt everywhere. Church bells tolled across continents. Candles were lit in cathedrals from Buenos Aires to Berlin. People paused in subway stations and shopping malls to whisper prayers. It wasn't just Catholics who mourned, it was the world. Because Pope Francis wasn't only a religious leader, he was a symbol, a bridge, a quiet revolutionary wrapped in white robes and humility. He broke boundaries with compassion. He questioned traditions with tenderness. He spoke truth without venom. From presidents to priests, from actors to activists, tributes flooded in within hours. U.S. President Joe Biden called him a moral compass in uncertain times. Archbishop Justin Welby of Canterbury said Francis reminded us of the sacredness of simplicity. Others called him the people's pope, a man who walked among the poor, rode in small cars, and carried his own bags, even after becoming one of the most powerful faith leaders on earth. But what truly defined this moment wasn't just the outpouring of emotion, it was the unity. People who hadn't set foot in a church in years found themselves lighting candles. Social media, so often filled with division, became a digital cathedral of grief. Different denominations, different faiths, even non-believers, all came together, if only for a moment, to honor a man who stood for something greater than power. And then, in the middle of this global mourning, came something no one expected. A voice that surprised many. A voice from an entirely different corner of Christianity, one known more for flash than for Franciscan humility. Creflo Dollar, a name often associated with prosperity, planes, and pulpit controversy, stepped forward with a message that would spark its own kind of reaction. And that's when things took a turn. One no one saw coming. Creflo Dollar's unexpected tribute. In a moment that left both critics and believers doing a double-take, American televangelist Creflo Dollar stepped forward with a tribute that no one saw coming. Known worldwide for his teachings on wealth, success, and the so-called prosperity gospel, Dollar has never been a figure closely aligned with the Catholic Church. In fact, his brand of ministry often exists in stark contrast to the message of simplicity Pope Francis so fiercely championed. But this time, something shifted. Pope Francis showed the world what it means to serve with humility, Dollar said in a live stream just hours after the Vatican's announcement. He didn't need riches to be respected. He earned it through grace. Those words echoed across the internet. People replayed the clip. Screenshots of the quote circulated on social media. Was this the same Creflo Dollar? The same man who once asked for donations to fund a multi-million-dollar private jet? It didn't take long for reactions to pour in. Some were skeptical. Some were genuinely moved. But what most people agreed on, it felt authentic. There was no theatrics, no hype, just a quiet, serious reflection on a man Dollar clearly respected. And in that moment, something powerful happened. A bridge was built, not between denominations, but between values, between humility and influence, between tradition and charisma, between the gold-plated pulpits of American televangelism and the worn wooden pews of Rome. Many were left wondering what moved Dollar to speak. Was it conviction? Respect? A personal turning point? Regardless of the motive, the impact was undeniable. This wasn't just a tribute. It was a moment that cracked open a new kind of dialogue, one that asked whether people from vastly different spiritual paths could, in times of loss, find shared ground. Because when someone like Creflo honors someone like Pope Francis, it forces us to look past robes and rings, past doctrine and dogma, and focus on something deeper, the heart behind the ministry. It also invites a bigger question. How do two men who seem like opposites reflect the same God? One preaches from a mansion. The other walked among slums. One rides in jets. The other rode in hatchbacks. And yet, there's a thread that connects them. To understand it, we have to look at the very different lives they lived, and how each chose to walk their path of faith. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Prosperity versus simplicity. On paper, Creflo and Pope Francis couldn't be more different. Their images, their lifestyles, even their sermons, they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. One is seen stepping out of luxury cars and preaching in designer suits. The other quietly strolls through Vatican courtyards in worn-out shoes, carrying his own briefcase. One speaks the language of prosperity. The other speaks the language of poverty. Creflo has long been a lightning rod for controversy, especially over his emphasis on financial blessings. He's spoken openly about wealth as a sign of divine favor, encouraging believers to sow seeds into his ministry, promising that faith and generosity will lead to abundance. It's a message that resonates with many, but also raises eyebrows. One of his most infamous moments came when he launched a campaign to raise $65 million for a private jet, citing the need to spread the gospel more efficiently. That moment became a symbol for critics of excess, for supporters of faith in provision. Now contrast that with Pope Francis, a man who could have lived in marble-lined Vatican luxury, but instead chose a modest guest house, the Domus Sanctae Marthae. He wore the same white cassock day after day and regularly drove around in a second-hand Ford Focus. He rejected elaborate titles and golden rings. He insisted on being called Father, not Your Holiness. But here's the twist. Both men, in their own way, believed they were doing the right thing. Both saw themselves as vessels of God's work. Both wanted to bring hope, healing, and spiritual breakthrough to their followers. That's where the conversation gets deeper. Is prosperity the evidence of God's favor? Or is humility the highest form of service? Can abundance and simplicity coexist in the same spiritual space? This contrast isn't just about money. It's about meaning, about how two men interpreted faith, leadership, and the role of a modern-day spiritual guide. And while one drew crowds with promises of increase, the other drew them in with the quiet power of compassion. And just when it seems their paths couldn't possibly intersect, we discover that they did. Not in practice, but in principle. Because underneath the robes and riches, there was a message they both couldn't stop preaching. A message about grace. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. Grace and redemption. For all their differences in lifestyle, theology, and even controversy, Pope Francis and Creflo shared something powerful at the heart of their ministries, a deep, unshakable belief in grace. Not just as a concept, but as a lifeline, as a force that could transform even the most wounded soul. Grace, the unearned, undeserved favor of God. It's a word that has echoed from pulpits and stained-glass sanctuaries for centuries. But these two men made it personal. Pope Francis famously said, "The name of God is mercy." He believed that no one was too far gone to be embraced by the love of Christ. In a church often criticized for its rules and rigidity, Francis became a voice for the forgotten. He visited prisons and kissed the feet of convicts. He welcomed the homeless to dine with him in the Vatican. He reached out to those who had felt pushed out of the church, divorced couples, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people burdened by shame. His message was clear: come home. Creflo Dollar, on a different stage but with similar conviction, echoed that same invitation. After years of preaching about performance, obedience, and giving, he experienced a shift. He began to preach more about grace than guilt. In one of his most viral sermons, he said plainly, "I want to correct some things I taught. Tithing was never a requirement for righteousness. Jesus is enough. Grace is enough." It was a moment of humility, and for many, it was a turning point. Like Pope Francis, Dollar began to point not to rules, but to relationship. Not to fear, but to freedom. The beauty of their message was that it didn't rely on perfection. It welcomed imperfection. Grace, they taught, isn't about what you do. It's about who God is. And that message, though delivered in two very different accents and settings, resonated across millions of hearts. In a world burdened by cancel culture, political division, and spiritual burnout, grace felt like water in a desert. But now that Pope Francis is gone, the question rises like incense in a cathedral. Who will carry that message forward? The world is watching and responding. And not just religious leaders. Presidents, prime ministers, activists, artists. Because Francis didn't just impact the church, he touched the world. And that's where we go next. Global leaders pay homage. From presidents to prime ministers, kings to activists, the tributes haven't stopped. U.S. President Joe Biden, a devout Catholic, called Pope Francis a force for compassion. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi praised his efforts to promote global peace. It wasn't just politicians. Artists, athletes, and faith leaders from all corners of the world paid their respects. The Dalai Lama sent prayers. Anglican bishops remembered his generosity. Even celebrities, often distant from religious topics, shared heartfelt posts. Why such a wide reaction? Because Pope Francis wasn't just a Catholic leader. He was a global figure who stood for something bigger. He defended refugees. He spoke against climate destruction. He wasn't afraid to challenge injustice, even if it meant backlash. One bishop said, "He made the church feel more human." And in a time where so many are disillusioned by institutions, that mattered. But the heart of who Francis wasn't about fame or politics. It was about something far simpler. A legacy of humility and service. From the very start of his papacy, Pope Francis broke traditions. He walked instead of being chauffeured. He cooked his own meals. He even paid his own hotel bill after being elected pope. Why? Because he believed leadership starts with service. He once said, "A shepherd should smell like his sheep." And he lived it. He visited slums in Brazil, kissed lepers in Africa, and embraced immigrants at sea. He didn't just talk about love, he showed it. His message was consistent. Go to the margins. Find the hurting. Bring them in. The church is not a museum, he once declared. It's a field hospital after battle. He wasn't perfect. He faced criticism, even from within the church. But he kept showing up, kept bending down to wash feet, kept choosing people over prestige. And in doing so, he built something rare: real trust. Now, in the wake of his passing, others are picking up the torch, including those far outside his tradition. A call for unity. Pope Francis believed the walls between churches were meant to come down, not get taller. He met with Protestants, Orthodox leaders, even evangelicals. He believed that while doctrine matters, love matters more. He once told a gathering of Christian leaders, "We have more that unites us than divides us." Creflo Dollar's tribute echoed that same spirit. In honoring Francis, he stepped outside his lane and into a moment of real connection. That single act showed people that unity isn't just possible, it's powerful. In a world often torn by division, Francis modeled a different way. And maybe, just maybe, his legacy will push others to do the same. But not everyone agreed with Francis's path, and both he and Dollar have something else in common. They stood firm through fierce criticism. Standing firm in beliefs. While Pope Francis was widely admired, his bold stance on controversial issues often drew fierce criticism, even from within the Catholic Church itself. He opened doors that had long been sealed. He spoke out on LGBTQ plus inclusion, climate change, immigration, and economic inequality. To some, he was a breath of fresh air. To others, he was too progressive, too political, too unpredictable. Still, he never backed down. When asked about backlash, Francis famously said, "I prefer a church that is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets." His goal was never to maintain comfort. It was to cause holy disruption. And Creflo Dollar, he knows a thing or two about standing in the fire. After decades of preaching prosperity and wealth, he shocked the world when he publicly walked back his own teachings on tithing. "I want to start by saying I was wrong," he told his church. "I misled people." That one moment went viral. He was slammed by critics, praised by others. But most importantly, he didn't run from it. He owned it. Both men, in their own ways, challenged expectations. And while their messages didn't always line up with tradition, they kept preaching, kept leading, kept risking backlash for what they believed was right. The cost of leadership? Criticism. But the reward? Influence. And now, in the silence that follows the Pope's final breath, the voices left behind are calling people not just to grieve, but to grow. Because even in death, there's a message of hope that refuses to fade. A message of hope. Amid grief. When grief fills the air, hope becomes more than just a feeling. It becomes a lifeline. That's the tone Creflo Dollar took when he spoke out about Pope Francis's death. He didn't just mourn. He offered a message. "The world didn't lose a leader," Dollar said. "We gained an example." And that's what this moment is. A reminder that the values Francis lived for didn't die with him. They live on in every act of service, every broken barrier, every soul that chooses mercy over judgment. Pope Francis always believed that light shines brightest in the darkest moments. He comforted the grieving, embraced the broken, and reminded the world that God's love was not reserved for the few. It was for everyone. That's why his funeral won't just be a ceremony. It'll be a call to action. And in churches around the world, Catholic, Protestant, and beyond, that message is echoing. Grief doesn't mean the end. It's the beginning of reflection, of purpose, of recommitment. As the days unfold and the mourning deepens, people aren't just asking, "Why did he go?" They're asking, "What can I do now?" That's where the power is. And that's where forgiveness and reconciliation begin, with honest hearts, open hands, and a willingness to change. The power of forgiveness and reconciliation. Pope Francis will be remembered for many things, but perhaps most of all, he'll be remembered for how he forgave. Again and again. He forgave corruption inside the church. He forgave critics who mocked him. He forgave those who had fallen, and he reached for those who felt they had no way back. Forgiveness wasn't just a teaching to him, it was a lifestyle. He said once, Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door of resentment and the handcuffs of hatred. That message hit hard in a world filled with division, and it resonated, even outside the Catholic Church. Creflo Dollar, in his own journey, echoed a similar path. After years of preaching in a certain direction, Dollar made a choice to forgive himself, publicly. That kind of honesty isn't common in the pulpit, but it's powerful, and it's necessary. Forgiveness has a ripple effect. When leaders admit faults and choose grace, they create space for others to do the same. That's the kind of ripple Pope Francis started, and it's still moving. He met with victims of abuse. He apologized for the Church's past failures. He invited those who felt exiled to come home. And in doing so, he turned a rigid institution into something more human, more vulnerable. That's what people needed. Not perfection, not politics, but peace. And maybe that's the final gift of his papacy, the courage to say sorry, and the strength to start again, because once forgiveness takes root, it can transform everything. And the question now is, who will carry that torch forward? Inspiration for future generations. Some leaders are remembered for their titles. Others are remembered for their impact. Pope Francis falls into the second group, because what he left behind is bigger than the Vatican, bigger than Rome, and far bigger than the Catholic Church. He left behind a vision of a faith that doesn't point fingers, but extends hands. A church that doesn't wait for people to become perfect, but meets them in their mess. A leadership model based not on control, but on compassion. For young people, many of whom had grown disillusioned with organized religion, Francis was different. He was real. He spoke their language. He talked about mental health, about climate anxiety, about loving your neighbor not just in theory, but in practice. He once said, "The youth are not the future, they are the now." And he treated them that way. He empowered them, listened to them, and invited them to lead. Creflo Dollar echoed that in his own reflection, reminding young believers that legacy isn't just about what you leave behind, it's about what you build now. Be bold in love, he said. Be fearless in faith. And that message, it stuck. Because in a world where so many feel powerless, the idea that faith can be active, present, and world-changing, that's revolutionary. Francis didn't create a generation of followers, he inspired a generation of leaders. And as his body is prepared for final burial, his message is already finding new life, in classrooms, in pulpits, in the streets. But before the world can move forward, there's still one moment left. A final goodbye. Honoring a life well lived. The preparations have begun. Dignitaries are arriving. Pilgrims are flooding into Rome. The Vatican is draped in mourning, but it's not just sadness, it's reverence. Pope Francis's funeral is set to be one of the most significant events the Church has seen in decades. Not because of the ceremony, but because of the man. He will lie in state at St. Peter's Basilica, his simple white cassock and wooden cross, a stark contrast to the grandeur around him. Thousands will file past in silence, offering prayers, tears, or just a moment of awe. And among them, people from every background, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, atheist. Why? Because Francis belonged to everyone, not in doctrine, but in spirit, in the way he made people feel seen. One cardinal said, "This is not a funeral. This is a thank you." And it's true. Every embrace, every act of courage, every word of mercy, this is the fruit of a life poured out for others. As the bells toll one final time, the Church will turn a page, and with it, a question begins to rise. What happens next? Continuing the mission. What lies ahead? The death of a pope is not just the end of a life. It's the beginning of a transition. The Catholic Church now faces a historic moment, choosing a new leader, charting a new course, and continuing a mission that millions believe in. But whoever steps into that role will inherit more than a title. They'll inherit the weight of a legacy that challenged traditions, welcomed outcasts, and redefined what leadership looks like. And beyond the Vatican, leaders like Creflo are also taking stock. Because the message of compassion, service, and humility, it didn't die with Francis, it caught fire. Dollar urged his followers, let's not just remember the Pope. Let's become what he believed in. That's the challenge now. Not to idolize the man, but to live the message. Churches around the world are asking, how do we care more? Love louder? Forgive faster? There's no clear roadmap, but the path is lit. And Pope Francis, in life and in death, gave us the first steps. This isn't the end of a story. It's the passing of a torch. And the question now is, who will carry it? Because the mission is not over. It's only just beginning.